Hello everyone, this is the third video in my series of reviews of the Famicom Wars franchise, also known as Advance Wars and Game Boy Wars. Today we're wrapping up the pre-Advance Wars era with Game Boy Wars 3, Hudson's final entry into the series. The previous Game Boy Wars games were, let's be perfectly honest, total rehashes of the same thing when you get right down to it, but this time Hudson went all out. They've overhauled the mechanics, added new units, and a good number of other features that truly make Game Boy Wars 3 stand out. You may wonder then why you've never heard of this game, aside from it being an obscure Japan-only entry in the series. Well, one look at the release date should confirm that reason for you. August of 2001. That's right, the Game Boy Advance was already out worldwide by that point, and Advance Wars itself was releasing the next month. There was no room for a niche war game on an old system, even if it was the most polished and innovative entry thus far. I'm not even sure where to start with the gameplay changes in this game, as it's unlike any other in the series. Let's start with buildings. In the previous games, buildings had 20 CP, and a foot soldier could reduce that CP by however many HP they had every turn, and if the building hit 0 CP, the capture is made. This applies in Game Boy Wars 3, except now the income a building provides, and the amount of HP a building restores is also controlled by CP. A new unit, this bulldozer truck thing, can develop buildings to increase their CP, and a new plane unit destroys terrain and reduces CP of buildings, which lets you pull off the most fun strategy ever. Bomb the enemy HQ, then when its CP is down to just 1, send in your foot soldier to secure it for the win. That's just the simplest of the new gameplay mechanics here too. There are now 2 resources needed to build more units, gold and materials. Gold is given by every building type except factories, which give materials. Some units can be built only at factories, but cities and the HQ can build all of their land units. The supply truck and bulldozer also use a special resource for their own functions that they can only restore at factories. Speaking of the bulldozer, this new unit is just the most amazing thing. It has the highest amount of utility I've ever seen in a Wars game. It not only develops buildings, it can also construct bridges over rivers, clear away forests and wastelands. It can make roads, it can build a temporary airport, a feature that we don't see again until Advance Wars Days of Ruin. No more getting stuck in the middle of nowhere without a place to get fuel. There are new transport units, and transporting itself is overhauled. Originally, a unit unloaded from a transporter couldn't move or attack after being unloaded. In Game Boy Wars 3, they can move after being unloaded, assuming they weren't loaded in the same turn anyways. It makes a huge difference, as if you unloaded on the front lines, the unit would be a sitting duck until the next turn in the previous games, and that's especially important for the aircraft carriers, as the large carrier can repair up to 4 air units at once. When they're ready to go, all 4 can unload and strike in one turn, and the carrier itself has anti-air missiles. Awesome! It's one of the most amazing ways of taking down enemy forces ever. There's even a transport plane for carrying any lightly armored land unit by air. Are you starting to see how different this game is from the rest of Advance Wars? We haven't even gotten to the combat. There's a lot to say about combat itself. Hudson brought in a couple of mechanics from their other game, Nectarus, aka Military Madness. You'll find that it's now very difficult to dance around enemy units willy-nilly, because if you move into a square that is adjacent to an enemy unit, you have to stop there, no questions asked. If you surround or even pincer enemy units, you'll gain attack and defense boosts, and penalties if there are multiple enemy units surrounding you, of course. The biggest change is the initiative system. Every unit has a certain initiative score, and moving and firing in the same turn reduces it for the turn. In direct combat, the unit with a higher initiative attacks first, and in a tie, they attack simultaneously. This means direct combat units can actually attack without risking getting blown to bits. All we're missing is a combat forecast like Fire Emblem has. You can at least tell by the cursor color who's going to strike first in any given battle, but damage calculation is a lot more difficult to do on your own. Then you have the units themselves. The Navy was expanded again, but they mucked it up because there's no battleship and therefore barely any sea-to-land interaction. There's the Aegis Warship, which can fire on Navy units at range and air units directly. Aircraft carriers return in two variants, large and small, each with anti-air missiles and a hefty carrying capacity. The lander unit now carries 3 units instead of 2, but is fairly slow and fragile. There's a tanker unit for getting fuel to your boats, however it does not refuel the submarine, which also makes a return. And the submarine is unfortunately where most of Game Boy Wars 3's Navy problems lie, because it can only be hit by other submarines and the new anti-sea helicopter unit. Yes, an air unit! I mean, if you've got aircraft carriers, they're just going to launch its missiles at the thing from long range. You've also got fighters. I assume you would have fighters. So, since submarines can only be hit by 2 other kinds of units, your Navy is probably going to consist mostly of them throughout the campaign. I mean, they can't get refueled by tankers, and they have limited ammo stock, so if you want to refuel them, you're going to have to send them to or keep them near a harbor. Which makes the Navy, unfortunately, even more annoying. There's no recon in Game Boy Wars 3 because there's no fog of war in Game Boy Wars 3, thank goodness. Instead, they've added 2 new car units, the combat buggy and the battle car, which are speedy, lightly armored, and designed to take out specific kinds of enemies quickly. There's a lot of unit variety in Game Boy Wars 3. There may even be too many units in the game. I mean, I'm all for variety of units, but if there are too many units doing the same thing, I just have to sit there and wonder why they're included. I went through the entire campaign without ever using tanks, oddly enough, because my artillery and air force were doing the job of taking out enemy land units just fine. I barely used the combat buggy and the battle car for the latter part of the campaign for the same reason. Oh, and this game also has way too many transport units. There's a transport truck, which is the fastest and most lightly armored. There's the classic APC unit, and an infantry fighting vehicle.
A troop transport that can't carry troops, a reconnaissance vehicle that's too conspicuous to do reconnaissance,
and a quasi-tank that has less armor than a snowblower, but has enough ammo to take out half of DC.
I suppose it's up to the player what they end up using in the end. But with all the transport options, you might wonder why regular infantry are even in this game when you could just use mechs. They might be 1 space slower, but they have ranged bazookas, with only 1 ammo, of course, so you've gotta refuel them when you can. Oh, and by the way, in this game, ranged units can move and fire in the same turn, unlike in the other games. Single-player modes consist of an optional tutorial on some of the game's finer points, a campaign consisting of 45 stages in total, and Standard mode, which just has 30 maps to clear as Red Star or White Moon, like in the previous games. And Campaign mode is its own beast. Normally, units deployed in one map don't carry over to the next, but in the campaign of Game Boy Wars 3, they do. You can deploy surviving units to the next battlefield, which is important because you can do this for free, and the experience system from Super Famicom Wars is back, only you can gain experience for non-combat actions like supplying and transporting too. The differences between Campaign and Standard are also interesting to look at too. Since Campaign lets you deploy surviving units for free, there's less of an incentive to capture and develop property aside from having faster repairs. And if you need newer, expensive units, most maps give you a good chunk of resources at the start of the round. In Standard mode, or in Versus Play, capturing developing property is definitely important because you need lots of resources to keep the units flowing, especially if it's one of those expensive Navy battles. Maxing out the levels of some units in Campaign mode also makes it possible to promote that unit in the next battle, which I swear they had to have borrowed from Fire Emblem. Many of the units in the game can promote, and when they do, they usually turn into something monstrous. Like, we're talking tanks and helicopters with ranged cannons, and fighter jets with indirect missiles. Yes, indirect air units. You will not see that in any other Famicom Wars game. You're gonna need all that too, because White Moon's packing one of the biggest armies I've ever seen. I was stuck on this one map where there are dozens upon dozens of indirect fighters flooding the place for quite a while. And you have to beat this one to get the best ending. Wait, no. To get the best ending, you have to beat this map quickly. Oh, and the enemy phase takes forever due to the massive number of units, but that's part for the course. Hope you have Emulator Turbo. Ah, yes, there are indeed multiple endings. You don't play all 45 missions in the game. You take certain paths based on how long the mission took to clear. There are lots of branching paths, and some of them have dead ends. You ultimately want to end up in either map 44 or preferably map 45. Brace yourself though, this campaign is extremely difficult. You really need to balance out your army since you can't have more than 50 units including survivors of the previous battle. You don't want any dead weight in your army. If you find yourself using certain units less and less, go ahead and get rid of them. You only need to obtain all units at least once for the all-unit medal. You don't need to keep them forever. All this and more makes for a fairly fun experience that I can actually recommend you play at least once, like with Super Famicom Wars. You probably could even beat the game and get the second best ending. Or if you're really good, the best ending. Thing is, this is one of the games where you really need to study the mechanics and know what you're doing. It'll be especially helpful to plot out a path through the game. You really can't play it blind. Oh, but we're not done. This game has even more features. The map editor returns with customizable rules. Multiplayer is still an option, though apparently it uses the Game Boy Color IR port, which is strange, but okay. Oh, and another thing. This game uses the GB mobile system, which you might remember was something Pokemon Crystal used to handle an early form of online battling and trading through the phone system. Well, this game did too! You can see the remnants of a message board and online battle or map exchange system. Sure, it was exclusive to Japan, and sure, it's shut down now, but you have to admire how daring Hudson was at the time. I don't imagine it was a popular online game considering the Game Boy Advance was already out, though. Ah, but it ain't all sunshine and daisies, because they also included, I kid you not, microtransactions. Yes, you could pay money to add special mercenary units to your squad through the mobile system by capturing the communications towers throughout the campaign. And since one of the achievement-style medals is acquired by obtaining all units in the game at least once, including the mercenary units, it's a rather bad stand on the game, but I don't let it bother me too much. For one thing, you don't even need mercenary units to beat the game. And second, there is in fact a glitch in the game that lets you get them all for free anyhow. Oopsie! Well, that's Game Boy Wars 3. Probably the most playable Famicom Wars game up to this point, and certainly the most innovative and creative. Probably the hardest, too. I'm really surprised this never came out on a virtual console or anything at all. It's kind of one of Hudson's best games in my opinion. We'll be seeing some of the ideas here surfacing in the future Advance Wars games. By the way, those are coming up next. Next up is the first Advance Wars, where Famicom Wars finds a new audience overseas and leaves its home country behind. Basically. I mean, that's kind of what happened.